All right, let's dive in today, and we're going to be looking at the UN, the United Nations, and more specifically, its role in trying to keep the world, peaceful and secure.
Yeah.
And this is something, if you're out there and you're prepping for those UPSC exams, you've probably seen this text before, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's like, I don't know if it's required reading, but it's pretty darn close for anybody who's, trying to tackle international relations.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's a dense read.
Yeah.
A lot of information.
Yeah.
But super relevant, especially I think, when we get into, some of these big questions like, has the UN actually gotten rid of war like the charter says it's supposed to do, or is that, debatable? I mean,
is it just like luck, or is there, something else going on? So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, let's get into it.
And I think the text starts out, right at the very beginning with the foundations.
Yeah.
Article 1.
Yeah.
It's all about maintaining international peace and security.
Right.
And they really emphasize that the Security Council is at the heart of that.
At the helm, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to be the main decision maker when it comes to, when there's issues with peace and security. It's like, Security Council, what are we going to do? But, I think one of the interesting things that the text points out is that, there are some really contrasting perspectives on how effective the UN had actually been.
Right.
At doing that, at keeping the peace.
Yeah, and it's almost like this historical tug of war.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where you have folks who say, no, the UN deserves all the credit for stopping World War III.
Yeah.
Look, it's been around. We haven't had one.
Hasn't happened.
Well, they must be doing something right.
Yeah.
And then you have, those realists, the people who are like, well, hold on a second. Maybe it's not the UN. Maybe it's just because of that whole, Cold War nuclear thing.
Right.
Where everybody's just too afraid to actually go to war because they might, blow up the planet.
Yeah. Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I launch, you're going to launch, and we're all going to go.
Yeah. So how do you, I mean, that's a tricky thing to measure, right?
Yeah.
How do you measure the effectiveness of something that didn't happen? You know what I mean?
It's a tricky counterfactual,
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to really get into the structure of the UN and kind of understand what are its limits, what can it actually do.
Right.
And one of the big things that the text really points out is, it can only be as effective as its member states.
Right.
And particularly, there's those 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
Right.
The US, the UK, France, Russia, and China.
The P5.
The P5, yeah.
Yeah.
They have a lot of power.
Right. And that kind of brings us to this idea of collective security.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which on paper sounds really simple.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Right.
Hey.
All the nations are going to get together, and if somebody gets aggressive, we're all going to, stop them.
Right. You got each other's back.
Right. But then in reality, it's really complicated.
It's much more complicated because, one of the things the text points out is that the UN doesn't actually have its own army.
Right.
Right. It has to rely on these member states to contribute troops for peacekeeping missions.
Right.
And, getting all these countries with their different interests and priorities to actually work together, it can be really hard.
Yeah.
And, the text points out that this was especially hard during the Cold War.
Right.
Can you imagine trying to, get the US and the Soviets to agree on anything?
Oh.
It was almost impossible.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to think about how that dynamic actually played out within the UN.
Right?
Right, because the text talks about they were constantly clashing.
Yeah.
Right, the US and the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
And it would paralyze the Security Council. They couldn't do anything.
It would just constantly at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And using that veto power to block anything that they didn't like.
Right. Yeah, and the text even has some specific examples.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, between 1946 and 1955, the Soviet Union used its veto power 82 times.
Yeah.
82 times. That's a lot of vetoes.
Yeah.
And then after 1970, it kind of flipped. The U.S. started using it more.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I guess that shows how, the power dynamics were shifting.
Exactly. It really reflects, what was going on in the world at the time, Right.
Who had the power, who was trying to, exert their influence.
Right. So it's not just about, what's happening within the UN. It's about like the whole global context.
The whole big picture of international relations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But even within all that tension, right? Like the UN still managed to do some good things.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
The text mentions like helping with a ceasefire between India and Pakistan back in 1959.
Yeah.
So there's, evidence of them actually being able to like resolve conflict.
Yeah. They're not just, sitting there arguing all the time.
Right, right.
Right.
But, the text is fair. It also points out where they had some pretty big limitations.
Oh, yeah.
Like when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 79,
right.
there wasn't a whole lot the UN could do about that.
Yeah, they weren't able to prevent that.
Right.
And I think for anyone who's studying international relations, like, especially if you're thinking about, those UPSC exams, it's really important to look at these contrasting cases.
Yeah.
Like, not just the successes, but also, like, when things didn't go so well.
Right.
It's not about, simplifying things. It's about understanding that it's complicated.
Right.
It's nuanced.
Yeah, yeah. And for those UPSC folks out there, I bet being able to analyze like both sides of that.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Why did they succeed here? Why did they fail there? That's got to be like gold.
That shows you really understand, what's going on. You
Right.
can think critically.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So moving on a bit, the text talks about, like after the Cold War ended,
Yeah.
there was this like renewed sense of optimism
Right.
about the UN.
Yeah, like, okay, the Cold War's over. Now the UN can finally, like, live up to its potential.
Right.
They don't have the superpowers constantly, fighting anymore. So maybe now they can really focus on, global cooperation and, solving problems together.
Yeah.
You actually saw, like, a decrease in the use of the veto.
Huh.
Yeah. So it seemed like things were, maybe moving in a better direction.
Right. Like a fresh start.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
A new chapter for the UN.
Yeah.
But, history's never that straightforward.
Right.
Right. As the text says, that initial hope, it kind of, gave way to disillusionment.
Right.
There were these, like, really high-profile failures, like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, where the UN just wasn't able to prevent these terrible atrocities.
Right.
And it raised all these questions again about, is the UN actually effective?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can it really do what it's supposed to do?
Right. And those cases, they're still being studied today.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Big time.
Trying to like figure out, what went wrong and we can learn from it.
Yeah. What are the lessons?
And I bet for our UPSC folks out there,
oh, yeah.
you're probably going to see those case studies on the exam.
Guaranteed.
Right. And it's not just about like knowing what happened. It's about being able to like really analyze them.
Right.
Right.
Critically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the text also gets into this other really interesting case study.
Yeah.
And that's the Gulf War.
Yes.
And this one, I think, really highlights how complicated the UN's role can be.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Especially when you think about like global power dynamics.
Yeah, who's got the power? Who's calling the shots?
Right, right. So can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Like, let's start with the 1991 Gulf War.
Yeah. So in 1991, the UN seemed to be pretty successful. They authorized Operation Desert Storm to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, and the U.S. stuck to the UN resolutions.
Right.
Which is interesting because that's really different from what happened later.
That's right.
Yeah, 2003.
Yeah, 2003, that's when things get a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
Right. Because in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq.
Right.
Even though, several members of the Security Council were against it.
Right.
Like France and Russia were like, no, we don't think this is a good idea.
Right.
But the U.S. was like, nope, we're doing it anyway.
We're going in.
Yeah. And that really showed how limited the UN's power could be.
Right.
Especially when you've got, one really powerful country.
Right.
Who's kind of dictating the terms.
Right. And the text even uses this term P1.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is basically saying the U.S. is the dominant power.
Yeah.
Right. It's a unipolar world.
It's a unipolar world.
Yeah.
And so, it raises this question, right?
Yeah.
Can the UN actually enforce international law when the biggest, strongest country is just doing whatever it wants?
Right.
It's
a big question.
It's a big question.
And one that's still relevant today.
Yeah.
As we navigate this, constantly changing global landscape.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thinking I think, for those UPSC folks.
Yeah.
That's what they're looking for,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not just about spitting back facts. It's about being able to, like, think about these complex issues
Right.
and really demonstrate that you understand international relations,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
And I think, it's not just for aspiring diplomats either. Like, this stuff is important for everyone,
Oh, yeah,
right?
for sure.
I mean, the UN, like, whether we realize it or not, it impacts all of our lives.
Absolutely. It shapes the world we live in.
Right.
Yeah,
So, wow, we've covered a lot here.
we have. Yeah.
We've talked about the UN's core mission, the challenges of collective security,
Yep.
the Cold War, those post-Cold War shifts in power.
But we're not done yet. We'll be back after a short break to really dive into how the UN is trying to handle this ever-changing world.
Yeah, we'll be talking about new global players, new types of conflict, and what it all means for the future of the UN. So stay tuned.
Stay with us. All right, so we're back, and we're really digging into, how the UN's role is changing. It's not static. It's not
Yeah.
just, the same old thing, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, we've been talking about this whole historical journey, right?
Yeah.
From, those Cold War tensions all the way to, how power shifted after the Cold War ended. And
Right.
now we're kind of stepping into the present and even looking ahead a bit, right?
Mhm.
And the text, keeps talking about this idea of a shifting landscape. Like, the world's facing all these new challenges.
Right.
And the UN has to, figure out how to adapt
Right.
if it wants to stay relevant.
Okay, so, what exactly has shifted? I mean, what's so different about, today's world compared to when the UN was first created? Well, I think, for starters, the way we even think about conflict has totally changed.
Okay.
We're not just talking about, two countries going to war with each other anymore.
Right.
There's terrorism, cyber warfare, conflicts over, resources, the instability that climate change is causing.
Right.
It's way more complicated.
Yeah, it's like all the old rules are out the window.
Exactly.
Like, a lot of these new conflicts, they don't even care about national borders.
Right.
You know?
And they involve all these different groups and organizations, not just governments.
Right.
It's not as simple as saying, oh, this country's fighting that country.
Yeah, right.
It's way more messy.
Yeah. And the text actually makes this point that I think is really interesting. Like, it argues that global capitalism itself can actually lead to conflict.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like, you think about, economic inequality.
Yeah.
Countries fighting over resources and just exploitation in general.
Mm.
A system that's focused on, profit above everything else, that can create a lot of tension.
For sure. And it's not always intentional,
Right.
but it's like a side effect of the way the system works.
Right. So it's almost like the UN's mission is expanding.
Right.
It's not just about stopping wars. It's about addressing these deeper issues
Exactly.
that are, creating instability in the first place.
It's you can put out a fire,
Right.
but if you don't deal with what caused it,
Right.
it's just going to keep happening.
It's going to keep coming back. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that makes things way more difficult for them.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
For sure. I mean, because, like we've been saying, the UN has to rely on its members to actually cooperate.
Right.
And not all countries agree on what's important, especially when it comes to, economics and power.
Right.
Everybody wants to be on top.
Right. And speaking of power, the text also talks about how there are all these new players on the world stage now. Right?
Right.
Absolutely. China, India, Brazil.
Yep.
These are countries that are, challenging the old way of doing things.
For sure.
And they're redefining, what it means to be powerful in the world.
Exactly. They're not just sitting back and, letting the old powers call all the shots.
Right, right.
They want a seat at the table.
Yeah, yeah. So the world's becoming more multipolar.
Right.
Right. It's not just the U.S. and the Soviet Union anymore.
Yeah, it's not that simple anymore.
Right. So how does the UN even deal with that? I mean, how do they stay relevant and effective when everything's so complicated?
That's the million-dollar question. I don't know if anybody really has the answer.
Right.
But, people are trying to figure it out. Scholars, diplomats, policymakers, they're all grappling with this.
Right.
And the text kind of suggests that the UN needs to adapt. It
Yeah.
has to find new ways to work with these emerging powers and to deal with these new types of conflict that are popping up all over the place.
So it's they have to find a balance, right?
Yeah.
Between that traditional role of being a peacekeeper
Right.
and this new, like, expanded mission of trying to solve the root problems that are causing conflict in the first place.
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing war, it's about creating a more just and fair world,
Right.
where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Okay.
And that's a much bigger task
Yeah.
than just, sending in peacekeepers to separate two armies.
Right.
It's about changing the system itself.
Right, right. And it's not just about the big, powerful countries either.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. The UN has to figure out how to make sure that smaller countries have a voice, too.
Exactly. Because, at the end of the day, the UN is supposed to represent the whole international community,
Right.
not just the powerful few.
Right. All nations, big or small.
Exactly. And it's not just about governments either. It's about working with civil society, with NGOs, with the people who are actually, living through these challenges.
All right, the people on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because let's be real, the UN can feel pretty distant sometimes. All these diplomats talking in fancy language.
Right, all these abstract ideas.
Exactly. But real people are affected by these decisions.
Right.
Their lives are on the line.
Right.
And I think for folks who are prepping for those UPSC exams,
Yeah.
that's a really important thing to remember.
Okay.
Don't just study the UN in theory.
Right.
Actually think about how its actions or inactions are affecting people in the real world.
Right. Like connect those dots.
Exactly.
Okay.
Bridge that gap between the theories and the human stories.
Yeah. That's good. And, I think the text also hints at another big shift that's happening and something that's relevant both for understanding the UN and for the UPSC exam.
Okay.
And that's the way we think about peace itself.
Oh, interesting.
Right. Like in the past, we just thought of peace as okay, there's no war.
Right. Like the absence of fighting.
Right, right. But now I think the world is realizing that peace is way more than that.
Okay.
It's about creating the conditions for lasting peace.
Right. So it's not just about ending violence, it's about making sure that violence doesn't start again.
Right, exactly. And the text, it doesn't use this exact term, but I think what they're getting at is this idea of positive peace.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I'm familiar with that concept.
Yeah. So positive peace means things like social justice,
Yeah.
economic equality, people being able to participate in their government,
Right.
all the stuff that makes a society fair and just.
Yeah.
Where people feel like they're being treated fairly,
Right.
so they're less likely to resort to violence.
Exactly. It's about addressing those root causes.
Right.
Right? Not just the symptoms.
Right, right.
And that's a huge challenge for the UN.
Yeah, it's way more ambitious.
Way more ambitious and way more complicated.
Right, right. But it also, opens up this whole new potential for the UN.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's not just about, putting out fires. It's about helping to build a world where peace is actually possible.
Yeah, it's like being an architect.
Right.
Right? You're not just fixing a leaky roof.
Right.
You're designing the whole building.
You're designing the whole thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good analogy.
Okay.
And this shift towards positive peace, it requires a different way of thinking about things.
Totally. It's not just about governments signing treaties. It's
Right.
about individuals, communities, civil society organizations.
Right.
Everybody has to be
I
involved.
just get bottom-up approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to build peace from the ground up.
Right. And it also means that peace isn't just this thing that happens and then it's done.
Right.
It's a process.
Yeah, it's ongoing. You got to keep working at it.
You constantly have to be working at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for our UPSC friends out there, understanding this idea of positive peace,
Oh, yeah.
that's got to be key for the exam.
Big time.
Right.
Because it shows that you're not just memorizing definitions.
Oh, right.
You're actually thinking about the complexities of peace.
Right. You're thinking critically. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you're studying the UN and its role in, global peace,
Yeah.
don't just stick to the old ways of thinking.
Right.
Expand your horizons.
Think about these evolving concepts.
Yeah.
Think about how peace, development, and human rights, they're all connected.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't separate those things.
Right. And don't be afraid to challenge assumptions.
Yeah. Right.
Question everything.
And come up with your own opinions.
Yeah. Form your own informed opinions.
Right.
That's what's going to make you stand out.
Right.
Whether you're, trying to be a diplomat or a policymaker or just an informed citizen.
Right. Right. Okay. So, wow, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has. Yeah. A lot to think about.
But before we wrap things up, we have one more segment where we're going to kind of like distill some of the key takeaways from this deep dive.
Yeah, we'll give you some concrete advice.
Yeah, especially for those of you who are tackling the UPSC exams.
Exactly. And we'll leave you with some questions to ponder, so make sure you stick around.
All right, so we're back, and it's time to, wrap up our deep dive here. We've been talking all about the UN and how it tries to, keep the peace and make the world a little less crazy.
Yeah, it's a big job.
It's a huge job. And we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've talked about, how the UN has evolved over time. It's like core mission, the things that make it hard for them to do what they're trying to do, and how they're trying to, adapt to this crazy world we live in.
Yeah, the world's always changing.
It's always changing. So let's try to distill some of this, into some key takeaways.
Yeah.
Especially for those of you out there who are, working hard, prepping for those UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
This is for you guys. This is to help you on your journey.
Sure, we're here to help.
So first things first, right? Remember that the UN, even though it's not perfect and people like to criticize it,
Oh, yeah.
it's still a really important institution for getting countries to work together.
For sure. I mean, it gives them a place to talk to each other, to try to solve problems through diplomacy,
Right.
to find some kind of common ground,
Right.
even when they disagree on a lot of other things.
Yeah, yeah. And for the UPSC exam, knowing how the UN is structured, that's like, you got to know that, right?
Absolutely. That's fundamental.
Like, you got to know what the General Assembly does. You got to know what the Security Council does.
Right. The International Court of Justice.
Yeah. All those different parts, right. And you got to know, what are their main principles? What are they trying to achieve?
Right. It's like the building blocks
Yeah.
of understanding the UN.
Right. But it's not just about, memorizing the UN Charter, right? It's about understanding, why things happen the way they do. How do countries use their power, and how does that shape what the UN can and can't do?
Right. It's about those dynamics.
Yeah. And the text, they really hammered that point home, right? The UN can only be as effective as its member states allow it to be. And if countries aren't willing to cooperate, well, the UN's kind of stuck.
Exactly. And we've seen that happen, right? When powerful countries decide to do their own thing, it can really undermine the whole system.
Right. And so for those of you prepping for the UPSC, being able to analyze those power dynamics, that's huge.
Yeah.
How are decisions actually made in the UN? Who has influence? Who's calling the shots? You got to be able to think about those things.
Right. Those are the important questions.
Yeah. And the Gulf War, that's a perfect example of this, right?
Yeah, good case study.
In 91, things seemed pretty united.
Right. Everybody was on board.
The Security Council said, okay, you can use force against Iraq.
Yep.
But then 2003, U.S. goes in.
Right.
Without that Security Council backing.
Mm-hmm.
And it just showed, how fragile that unity can be.
Exactly. And it really hurt the UN's credibility.
Right, right. So here's a little tip, right? Don't just focus on whether the UN, succeeded or failed in a specific situation.
Okay.
Go deeper, right? Think about, why did things turn out the way they did? What were all the different factors involved? What were the different countries trying to achieve?
Yeah.
That's how you're going to show that you really understand this stuff.
Yeah, that's the kind of analysis they're looking for.
Right, right. And here's another key takeaway, okay? The UN's role, it's not just about stopping wars. It's also about dealing with the things that cause conflict in the first place.
Right, like poverty, inequality, human rights abuses.
Yeah. And, promoting development, making sure people have, basic human rights, and making sure that international law is actually followed,
Right. It's a much broader mission.
Yeah. And the text, they talked about this shift from, traditional peacekeeping, where you're just, sending troops in to separate two sides that are fighting, to this more multidimensional approach.
Right. It's not just about stopping the fighting. It's about building a lasting peace.
Right.
So that the fighting doesn't start again.
Yeah, yeah. And that means thinking about economic development, making sure people have jobs, making sure society is fair.
Exactly. And that's where the UN's specialized agencies come in.
Right.
Organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, UNESCO.
Right. They're all working on these, big, complex issues.
Yeah. The stuff that can lead to conflict if it's not addressed.
Right, right. So for our UPSC folks out there, make sure you're familiar with these agencies, what they do, what their goals are, how they're trying to make a difference in the world. You might even want to pick one, like a specific agency or issue area, and really dive deep into that for your optional paper.
Yeah, that's a good
The
strategy.
UN does so much,
It's a huge organization.
you can't possibly cover it all.
Yeah.
So pick something and, really become an expert in that.
Right, showing you can go deep.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to think about. Okay, given all the craziness in the world today, right? New powers are emerging, conflicts are happening across borders, globalization is changing everything. How can the UN adapt? How can it become even stronger? How can it be more effective at keeping the peace in the 21st century?
That's a great question. And it's one that, we're all still trying to figure out.
Yeah. But, it's a question we're thinking about. So do your research, read different perspectives, talk to people, engage with these ideas. Because the future of the UN, and honestly the future of the world, it kind of depends on us being informed and engaged.
Yeah, knowledge is power. The more you understand about the UN, about international relations, about these big global challenges, the more you can do to help create a better world.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and never stop trying to make a difference. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel.
Stay curious, everyone.